There's been a big issue on my mind about the upcoming elections, and oddly enough, to answer it, we need to talk about Alaska.
A vast, rolling, endless space.
Alaska's unique this election cycle because for the first time they're using a system called ranked choice voting, which you may have heard about if you've watched elections in Maine, New York, or progressive cities dotted throughout the country. Alaska's ranked choice voting is unique in comparison to other places, and there are three main factors we have to keep in mind. 1, it's an open, nonpartisan primary where all the candidates will run. 2, only the top 4 vote earners will advance to the general election. And 3, during the general election, voters will be able to rank candidates according to their first, second, third, and fourth choice. Okay, so the style of voting is new for the state, and it's being uniquely implemented. But why? What is it supposed to do?
What if there is a fair way to determine winners on election night? Well, there is. It's called ranked choice voting.
So third parties and independents can run and win.
And it also ensures that we always elect the candidate with the broadest appeal.
Ranked choice voting works.
And that really gets to the heart at what I wanted to talk about today and why we're talking about Alaska. Will this fix our problems in America? And we do have problems.
Wait. Everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
I'm not saying this is a cult, but it is cult-like-ish.
I mean, literally, where's the line? How many elections are they going to steal before we kill these people?
Overnight, Minneapolis on fire. Described as all hell breaking loose in Seattle.
Gridlock is worse right now in America than it has been in decades, definitely longer than nearly anybody who's been alive has experienced. And everyone continually seems to be talking about hyper-partisanship, but what are we doing to fix it?
When it was more collegial, when people would work together, to a time when you couldn't even entertain a notion or a bill from the other side.
It's time to fix our democracy. We can do that with ranked choice voting.
And hold on, before you get the wrong idea here, I'm not saying that this is the solution. I'm not even sure if I'm willing to say that there is a solution, but what we're doing isn't working well. And we have an obligation to freedom, to democracy, to our country, to try and make it better.
Well, more than 50 people who voted in person or worked the polls during this month's Wisconsin primary have now tested positive for COVID-19.
When you do all mail-in voting ballots, you're asking for fraud.
I believe that Donald Trump won the election.
The risks of mail-in voting are obvious.
But Trump was telling everybody not to mail it in, right? That's why there's so much more mail-in Democratic votes, no?
No.
There are a large number of Americans who do not trust our election process, and that number has been trending upwards for years. Trust in the election, trust in government, and I have to ask, is this the right time to try to change things?
I think what's concerning is people are still remarkably susceptible to lies about what happens in other jurisdictions or other states.
Remember when we introduced the concept of ranked choice voting? We watched elections in Maine, New York, and we had mentioned Maine. Well, it was the only state that was actually doing it. This is the person that oversees that.
So we've been very fortunate that in some ways Maine is like one large small town, and that level of transparency and public participation in our elections has increased voter confidence. So I've even heard people say, well, in my town, I know it was fair, but I wonder what about, in those other states?
So maybe in small communities, local governments, it could feel easier to track, easier to verify or suss out misinformation. Ranked choice voting is more complicated. It's easier for proponents to tell you that it's not because they're trying to convince you it's a good idea. And good on them for trying.
Critics will say, maybe this is going to be a little complicated. The voter's going to go in, they're used to just picking one candidate, now they've got to rank. Is it too complicated?
It's actually really simple.
That is one big pile of shit.
But complicated isn't a bad thing. Innovation can be good. However, looking for results on the same timeline could be problematic.
We don't have results, but we have news about why we don't have results. This is an epic failure by the Iowa State Democratic Party.
The first big event of this year's U.S. presidential election is mired in confusion and uncertainty today.
During the Democratic caucus in Iowa, 2 men made similar claims to victory because of bad technology and ranked choice voting.
We are going on to New Hampshire victorious.
Thank the people of Iowa for the very strong victory they gave us at the Iowa caucuses on Monday night.
But as a political enthusiast, it was pretty entertaining when it happened.
Is this heaven? It's Iowa.
Iowa wasn't entirely the fault of ranked choice voting. Far from it. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out how candidates responded during that time of confusion. And if that's something that people are concerned about, maybe this isn't the time. But then again, maybe the time for change is long past due. When Alaskans go to vote in November, this is what their ballot will look like. The 4 people who won the primary election will be on here. However, there is a 5th spot for folks who do want a write-in, which is a strong tradition in Alaska.
And write-in, Ernest Greening.
And I announce today that I will be a write-in candidate in November for the United States Senate seat that I now hold. We're in this together.
The idea of ranking candidates goes like this. You vote for your favorites in the order you prefer them. If nobody wins on the first round with 50% plus 1 vote, the candidate who has the least amount of votes get knocked out. Anyone who voted that candidate who got knocked out has their votes redistributed according to who those folks preferred or voted for next. If nobody remaining has a majority by then, the candidate who is in last out of the 3 has their votes redistributed, so that of the 2 remaining, one of them has a majority. That is how everyone explains ranked choice voting, but that's not entirely accurate because of shrinkage.
I was in the pool! I was in the pool!
Shrinkage is how the total share of the vote decreases as candidates get eliminated, because not everybody votes for a second or third choice. Let me show you. Cups votes again, you get the idea. Nobody wins, so 4th is knocked out. Oh shit, look! A bunch of orange votes aren't making it into any of the cups. In fact, a pretty significant amount. Looks like over half of orange voters didn't rank past their first choice. So many that these cups are now too big to represent 50%. Because the total number of voters we are counting in the next round have decreased, which means all the candidates are closer to 50% because of the voter drop-off or shrinkage. Dang, looks like that was close, but green is a loser too, so let's redistribute. Similar to orange, the green voters just didn't rank past their first choice, and a lot of their votes are wasted and brought out of the equation for the final tally. Now it's just between these 2, and once again, we're gonna need some smaller cups. And this is what's so interesting to me. Without gaining any votes on the previous round, red can still win. This is not at all how people talk about ranked choice voting in the pretty videos I find online.
In a ranked choice voting election, a candidate needs to earn more than half of the votes to win.
Because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters.
One of the main criticisms of plurality or majority voting is that people can win with a plurality or less than 50% of the vote. But how is that any better or any different than ranked choice voting, which we clearly saw red win with less than 45% of the people who came out and voted in the election?
What ranked choice voting is designed to do is ensure that the winner has a majority.
Does this actually happen? Is this a real thing? To understand it, I had to talk with somebody who had a much better understanding of the numbers than me.
My name is Deb Otis. I work for Fair Vote. My primary job is to analyze election results.
Everyone, that's Deb. She's awesome. Let's start with the first and most obvious question. How often do people rank past their first choice?
A lot of this is about whether a voter sees multiple candidates on that ballot that they like, so they get to rank both of them. You know, in a 3-candidate race and in 4-candidate races, we typically see about 65 or 66% of voters choosing to rank multiple candidates.
So good, we've got an average, but that's also data that's compiled from everywhere. Is there anywhere that's more specific to Alaska?
Well, if we're looking for places with similar ideological leanings, then we might be looking for places that are more Republican or that have strong independent streaks. And so we might look to Maine, where their 2nd congressional district tends to be a district that leans red, and they got to use ranked choice voting for some party primaries over the past few years.
Remember when we talked about Maine and said that they used ranked choice voting? Maine? Well, it was the only state that was actually doing it? I don't know if that's entirely true.
We currently have closed primaries. Only Democrats can vote in the Democratic primaries, Republicans in the Republican primaries. But it was determined that ranked choice voting would apply to all primaries, and then in the general election, only to federal elections. So our US House of Representatives and US Senate, even presidential, but not the gubernatorial general election or the state legislative general elections.
Okay, so Maine's kind of dipping their toe in at a statewide level, whereas Alaska jumped in head first. Maybe there's some data we can at least get from Maine's 2nd congressional district.
Maine only releases their full data if the race goes multiple rounds. Now, in a couple of these races, I would love to dig into the race from Senator Susan Collins's re-election bid last year, but she won an outright majority of first choices, so she was declared the winner, no ranked choice voting needed, and so I never got to see that data.
Cool. Let's just talk about the primaries.
There was a competitive Republican primary in 2020 and a competitive Democratic primary in 2018. So we can track how Democrats and Republicans behaved differently. 74% of Democratic voters chose to rank multiple candidates. Only 65% of Republican primary voters chose to rank multiple. So in both cases, it's more than 2/3 of voters engaging here.
That disparity, small as it is, isn't surprising to me, because one side of the political aisle, the side that I'm a registered voter on, has been talking a lot more smack about elections lately.
We have found that candidates who oppose ranked choice voting or who encourage their voters to rank only them, that actually works. Voters do take their cues from the candidates or the party. We definitely advise candidates and campaigns against making that recommendation to voters, because some voters will listen to that, and ultimately, it's only hurting your own side.
The biggest factor will likely be the candidates themselves. If a politician is encouraging their voters not to participate, the system will likely fail for them. But if one side is doing all the encouraging and the other side isn't, this year's election could be an electoral bloodbath for one side. Alaska is a perfect place to test out ranked choice voting. It has a low population, notable gridlock in its state legislature, and one of the highest ratios of independent voters of any state. If people were interested in studying Alaska's results to see if they could implement this method of voting in their own state, I think there are 6 metrics we should talk about and how they relate to the positive claims of proponents of ranked choice voting. How do election results look compared to past elections? And don't worry, I've already done the homework, because since 2002, when Alaska started using a closed primary system, there have been 549 candidate elections held in the general. These include the presidential, congressional, gubernatorial, and all the state legislative races. Over that 20-year history, only 25 races weren't decided with a true majority. That's 4.5%. And because of the attrition and subsequently the shrinkage, candidates will be advantaged by their ideological partner, the one right next to them, being weaker. The real question is how big that attrition is, because the bigger the attrition, the more dramatic the shrinkage.
I'm optimistic that we're going to see a lot of rankings from Alaska voters. Generally, when an election is more highly publicized, people tend to rank more because voters know more about the candidates. So, Senate race, gubernatorial race, I think we're going to see upwards of 80% of voters choosing to opt in and rank multiple candidates. But overall, I'm optimistic we're going to see strong numbers, unless there is a concerted misinformation campaign about how ranked choice voting works, telling voters to rank only one, which would be a bad strategy, but it's possible.
I think this metric may be one of the harder ones for ranked choice voting advocates to overcome. If that's the case, we're going to have to redefine what a spoiler is. One of the main complaints I had heard leading up to the passage of ranked choice voting from Alaskans, and maybe the single strongest argument made by advocates, is that there are some pretty narrow pathways to getting elected. One on the Republican side, one on the Democratic side. And most people don't define themselves in either of those camps. I think success in this metric if you viewed this as a good thing, would be measured by asking if Alaska ends up having a more diverse candidate slate. Without trying to contradict myself here, I want to explain that people not ranking the totality of their ballot may not necessarily be a failing of the system.
It's always okay for voters to rank only one if they only like one. And a lot of times that'll happen. You're going to get 4 candidates on the ballot. There will be plenty of voters who look at that list and say, I'll vote for this person, but I really don't want my ballot counting for any of these other 3. And so a lot of voters will choose to rank only one, and that's an educated choice.
And if people make a conscious choice not to pick between the same binary system, it might be a sign that this system is working as intended. Gridlock in Alaska is similar, if not worse, than in Washington, D.C. The last few years have been defined by weakly held together majorities of rarely more than 22 out of 40 in the House or 13 of 20 in the Senate, which means that any initiative that people try to bring forward can be torpedoed often by a single member. This one is simple to measure. In January of 2023, does a majority organize on time, and how quickly do they get to work? This is one of the metrics that I'm most curious about. In places where they've successfully implemented ranked choice voting, ideologically similar candidates sometimes hold events together, are in commercials, hand in hand, reveling in their newfound camaraderie.
We are competitors, but we have been longtime allies.
The good thing is, and the lucky part is, we have ranked choice voting. So you get to vote for all 7 Democratic candidates.
And we believe that the only way the Democrats are going to win in November is if we elect a strong progressive. And you've got 2 of us right here.
Will this happen in Alaska? Do you think we'll see Kelly Chewbacca and Lisa Murkowski hand in hand telling Alaska to go vote when Kelly, a Republican, has been campaigning aggressively and negatively this whole time against Lisa Murkowski?
And she's been hurting our way of life. She's become more like them than us.
A fellow Republican. That seems very unlikely. And if I'm being honest here, I suspect that you'll see more of this behavior out of the left than the right. But if that's the case, I think it really disadvantages Republicans in Alaska. To judge this one, we just need to watch ads and read articles about events to see if anyone anywhere is working together.
For me, civility was a strategy. I knew I might not get the majority of first place votes, but if I could get my opponent's second place votes, then I would prevail. And so for me, it was a huge incentive not to engage in negative campaigning. Civility was a strategy, and it was a successful strategy.
There are a number of hard right and hard left House districts all throughout the state. Districts that, no matter what, you'd expect to see a Republican or Democrat holding the seat due to voting demographics. Do those candidates who had won the primary before and force voters into that binary choice between them and somebody who the voters viewed as an enemy, do they still hold on to that seat? By removing close primaries, you've removed an element of the partisan litmus test that took place in August. But was it removed entirely, or just moved to the general election? Often people who participate in ranked choice voting say it's preferable to a more binary system. Some polling has indicated that people feel more heard or better represented. RCV elections increase voter participation in primaries by sometimes as much as 10%. But does that apply to nonpartisan open primaries like in Alaska? Turnout in Alaska's primaries are generally low. Alaskans typically don't come out to vote unless there's an initiative or a referendum or something to draw them out in the primary. So I think besides polling and anecdotal information, we should be able to get a feel on this based on primary turnout results. Listen, I can't answer these questions, only time will. I don't know if it's going to be good for Alaska, nobody does. But for those of us living in Alaska, I sure hope so. And for those watching from outside, hopefully the lessons we learn in Alaska could be a guide for you to assess whether this system is right for your state.
Did you at least tell her about the shrinkage factor?
No, I'm not going to tell her about your shrinkage. Besides, I think women know about shrinkage.
Thanks so much for joining on this episode of The Review. Huge shout out and thank you to the State Secretary of Maine and Deb Otis of Fair Vote for taking the time to let me interview them for this piece. I'm experimenting around with a new format that is much, much more time intensive. So if you like this episode or found it informative, please like, comment, share, or subscribe. See you next time.